Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I speak with art historian, Associate Professor Anthony White from the University of Melbourne. Most of our conversation today revolves around his book, Italian Modern Art in the Age of Fascism. Towards the end of the conversation, we also discuss another project that he's involved in that revolves around studying the artwork of Italian prisoners of war in internment camps. In the middle, we discuss a range of topics like art's relationship to power, and Anthony challenges, should I call him Anthony? Is that rude? Professor White challenges a lot of the assumptions that many of us probably make when thinking about art in the period of fascism in Italy. I learnt a lot. I think you will too.
Art has always been in some form of discourse with power, but what was unique about art under the conditions of Italian fascism?
The unique thing about the relationship between art and power under fascism in Italy in the period from about 26 to about the early 40s, which is when Mussolini concerned himself with art, is that you have to consider that the state in Italy was really the chief patron for art. The private art market was very small. It was small to begin with, and a lot of things happened during the period. You have to consider, the Great Depression of the 1930s, which really affected the art world like every other part of the world. And one of the things that Mussolini was able to do was to say to the artists, here's some work. And we had in the USA the Works Progress Administration, where a lot of artists were put onto public projects to make art. Murals, often quite political, not in the sense we're talking about in relation to fascism, although there were some similarities, which are more to do with the fact that they were at the same time. But in Italy, you really did have this massive campaign of government-funded sponsorship of the arts. So what's unique about the relationship between art and power there is that fascism was the only show in town, right? So you kind of like what you do. And over time, what happened, as you may know, Mussolini got more and more dictatorial, became less in favour with other countries. For example, once the invasion of Ethiopia happened, the League of Nations put restrictions on the country, and so it was really difficult to move in and out of the country or to get people to buy things from Italy. So particularly in the second half of the 1930s, there's this real kind of monopoly, right? One of the things also Mussolini had in mind was this concept of autarky, which was Italy would be autonomous from the rest of the world, which was more of a pragmatic issue given that there were sanctions which had been put on the country in reaction to the invasion of Ethiopia. So that's one thing to talk about what's unique in Italy. I suppose, so that sounds from what I just said as if, Mussolini controlled the arts, but actually that's totally the opposite in a way of what happened. And so to add another layer to that, what's really unique about the relationship between art and power in Italy at the time is that the incredible diversity of the art that was being produced, right? So in Italy, you think about Hitler, you think about, okay, modern art, forget about it. So the Degenerate Art exhibition of 1937, they had stuff saying, people who make modern art are mad or Bolsheviks or, they're kind of sick. In Italy, particularly, in the late 20s, mid-30s, right up until the late 30s, there was none of that. There were futurists. So Marinetti, the man who launched the Futurist movement, which was all about modernity and speed and bright colour and fragmented forms in painting, for example, or barely recognisable forms in sculpture, not like a classical style at all. Marinetti was still in favour with the government. He was the Futurist movement was still going. It wasn't quite what it was in 1909 when it started to become more conservative, but it was still there. There were expressionists working in Rome, in the early 1930s. Some surrealists. There were abstract artists. So, for example, There was an abstract artist called Mario Radice, who I've written about, who was commissioned to create abstract paintings for a fascist headquarters in Como. It's a beautiful building produced by Giuseppe Terragni, the fascist headquarters in the city of Como, which had originally these beautiful abstract panels decorating it. They also had slogans by Mussolini on them as well, but they were essentially abstract panels. There were also, neoclassicism. There was symbolism. There was just the diversity of the styles of the art at the time were quite extraordinary. And so you have on the one hand this kind of, capturing the market for art by state sponsorship, and yet on the other hand, what's described as a kind of pluralism in the arts. That sounds like a contradiction.
That was actually quite interesting because as someone who, to be quite upfront, is completely ignorant about art history, I was surprised to learn through your book that there was this sort of pluralism. But you wrote as well that certain historians hadn't portrayed Italy under fascism that way, and that. So where did this idea come from, that it was all just sort of dictated by Mussolini? Is it simply just Italy getting painted with the same brush as Nazi Germany, where we just sort of blend them all together, or? That's
got a lot to do with it. The really quick version of the story is if you scroll back to post-World War II, late 40s, early 1950s, the Allies have won the war, and there is a lot of communist movements, political parties that are quite popular in Western Europe at the time. Togliatti in Italy, one of the biggest, or the biggest communist party in Western Europe. And when it came to matters of art, a lot of the communists, there's a lot of diversity there too, but they were tended to be more kind of like, let's have art that sort of speaks to the average person. It should be realism. We should be able to understand what it is. It should have a clear narrative. That's kind of anathema to modern art, essentially. And so the Americans and, the Allies, sort of some of the British thinkers and politicians were saying, well, this is a bit of a problem. What can we do? Well, we can sort of say the land of freedom, is where communism isn't in charge, because you can have abstraction. You can have anything you want. It doesn't have to be recognisable or tell a story. It can be just art that comes straight out of the artist's imagination. So there was this fight after World War II between sort of modern art and traditional classic art. And what happened was the Americans, for example, associated the abstract art with freedom, and then everything else got put into this bucket of totalitarianism, which included both communism and then fascism as well. And they had some justification for that, not just because of, in the Soviet Union there was socialist realism, which is a kind of version of realism which is attuned towards communist thinking. But we did have the fact that in a place like Germany, which you brought up earlier, Hitler was very, very strict about art, and there should be no modernity, there should be nothing modern, it should all be classical, traditional, recognisable forms, tell us great story about how great Germany is and all of that. So the historians that have told the story, particularly in English, it's important to say, have tended to paint fascist Italy as just a cultural backwater, just Mussolini telling people what to art make, people who did modern art fleeing, and there was a bit of that. But when you actually look at it, as I said before, there was a great deal of pluralism. And so one of the things I wanted to do in my book, and I'm not the first to do this, but I'm trying to tell a certain version of this story, which we can get into, is to just really make people, particularly, in the English-speaking and English-reading world, to really understand the diversity and the richness of art that was produced in Italy under fascism. And, sometimes this really amazing art that today we would say is modern was produced by people who were clearly anti-fascist, like, Carlo Levi, right? So he's a well-known figure as a writer, also a painter. But there are other artists who I've written about, like Scipione or Gino Bonichi, who was really, you would say, he wasn't really an anti-fascist. He was quite a young person, but he produced these. He produced these incredibly stunning artworks that are quite bizarre, nightmarish, and very, at a visual level, very innovative, very modern. And so it wasn't the case that, interesting art lined up with being left-wing and boring art lined up with being right-wing. That was really what happened, yeah.
At the end of your first answer, I feel like I interrupted you because you were just getting to the point about fascist Italy being the sole sponsor of art, but there also being this pluralism. How did the fascist state seek to navigate this contradiction?
Yep.
Presumably it had something to do with what you wrote about later, which is that they would pit certain schools of thought against one another, such as traditionalists and modernists. Is that kind of how they went about doing it?
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking being done about this recently, and to try to understand fascism and its relationship to culture more generally. And I guess one of the mysteries of fascism has always been, whether we're talking about Germany or Italy, is like why? Like why do people go along with it? It seems terrible and unbelievable now, but in other respects we're seeing it re-emerge, so it's becoming more understandable. But the key thing is to understand is that fascism did not rely on coercion solely or even principally for its success. Fascism in Italy and in Germany relied on a whole range of things that appealed to people. So fascism appealed to people's needs, wants, desires, hopes, hatreds, which we're more familiar with, but also the positive things. So if you thought your country was going to the dogs, the fascists had the answer. If you thought there were too many foreigners, they had the answer. If you felt you were poor and being overlooked and weren't getting a chance, they had the answer. But they had lots of different answers, and they had different answers for everyone. And so the way that fascism worked is consensus involved really reaching out to a very diverse range of people. I mean, Italy, it's a big country. It's got a lot of people in it, different regions, different dialects, different, classes. And to be successful, fascism had to really appeal to a broad range of people. And they did that by having a lot of different views that sometimes didn't even align with each other. And when it came to the arts, and it's important to clarify that if I say fascism had a pluralist policy towards the arts, it's important for me to stress that they didn't have a pluralist policy towards everything, okay? They didn't have a pluralist attitude towards political parties. They didn't have a pluralist attitude towards other countries, other races. They didn't have a pluralist attitude towards the press. Press was basically controlled. But in the arts, they did have an attitude of pluralism. And I think, as you were suggesting earlier, that not only did they sort of, rather than have one dominant style, which is what happened more or less in Hitler's Germany, they did pit different art movements against each other and see who would win, and just kind of let them kind of hate each other and compete and not really crown either one. But also just the strategy of pluralism, just offering a ribbon to everybody, meant that everybody sort of felt included and thought, a bit like a gambler, I might win again later. And it's that kind of, it's that sort of strategic pluralism which had though the basic intention of increasing the control over the art world rather than, letting it sort of do its own thing. So
it's a way to kind of keep people placated.
And not also identifying one single movement with fascism and saying, oh, look how bad that is, If you didn't sort of say, well, this is the movement, no, there was sort of nothing to attack because it was kind of everywhere. And that goes along with this idea of consensus, which is that you sort of appeal. So, fascism changed over the years. It started out as being anti-clerical. And saying get rid of the Pope and get rid of the King and all sorts of stuff, and then later on, it changed. So
open alliance with the Catholic Church, right?
Yes, absolutely. Of 929, the famous Lateran Pacts. So fascism seems like a contradiction in some ways, because of its contradictory ideologies in some respects and its contradictory art. But in fact, you can say that in a way that was part of a strategy to just make the control all the more effective.
There are so many directions I could go in right now. I'm just going to pick one.
Go for it.
When you use the word ideology, what do you mean by that? Is it more Because I feel like there are three different things it can mean. There's the really traditional sense, which I believe is a pathology of the mind. Then that evolved to what I assume you're talking about, which is just an extreme political position. Is that kind of how you're using it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if we're talking about fascist ideology specifically, it really emerged in the late 19th century as a response to really certain perceptions about the problematic aspects of modernity and positivism, and the idea that everything can be kind of measured scientifically, and also it was a reaction to other things like social change, so enfranchisement, of broader, more people getting involved in politics, urbanisation of the proletariat. I mean, there are so many things. It sort of starts out as a broad movement, but then it tends to the origins of fascist ideology in the thinking of Georges Sorel and people like that really was that what the country needed was a myth, and it needed a passionate response to historical events rather than a kind of logical one. And so you get these movements away from thinking about society and humanity and the world as being a kind of scientific fact that can be managed by the government, and rather something that was more like a movement of the spirit or kind of idea, And so it's a very complex thing to say. So, but I'm sort of trying to put it in the simplest way I can. And as so far as it affects this, what we're talking about, the art, is that there was a criticism about certain art movements at the end of the 19th century, like Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism, which were criticised for being just, oh my God, he's standing in front of, or she's standing in front of a landscape and just painting what he or she sees. And that was seen as just boring and also like not exciting enough. And so you get all these movements at the beginning of the 20th century that seek to change that. Now, they didn't all end up in fascism, but they all had something in common, which was this sort of critique of, I guess, what was perceived as a kind of meaninglessness of contemporary society that was sort of just being defined by measurable and observable quantities. So there you have the origins of fascist ideology. And there are aspects of fascist ideology that some people today would, maybe agree with. Not the extreme xenophobic and, the idea that, the state's welfare is more important than the individual. Well, I don't think people think that now today. But there are aspects, there were some social aspects of Mussolini's policies that, did have some benefit for the average person, and so it was appealing. So I think it's not quite right. I'm not sure you were saying this, but I think it's important to clarify that not everybody who believed in fascism, let's say artists, should be seen as crazy or demonic. They kind of, it sort of made sense in the context that they were living in. World War I, the Depression, a lot of social change, and there you are. You end up in that situation. It's a response to a situation that, is one of many options.
Yeah, no, I certainly wasn't saying that. I think I was just referencing that my understanding is that the etymology of the word is a mix of pathology and ideas, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah, that's probably right.
And then it evolved into what you're talking about. And then the third way, for anyone who's interested, is basically everything is ideology. So it's the underlying imperatives of social life. So essentially what we're compelled to do. But anyway, okay, so let's stick with fascist ideology. In your book, you mention the writings of Jeffrey Schnapp and the unstable ideological core of fascism.
Oh, yeah.
So what is that unstable ideological core?
So this idea by Jeffrey Schnapp, who is a fantastic writer, so anybody who is interested in this area of fascist culture more generally, he's very good on architecture but also art. He came up with the idea that essentially, along the lines we were saying before, that fascist ideology, the set of beliefs and convictions that kind of make up the everyday thinking of people at the time, is not something which can be defined very clearly, and we talked about the way there were these seeming contradictions within fascism. Now, you might say that's sort of true of any ideology, but in the case of fascism, a lot of people have observed that it seemed more contradictory than most, and in fact didn't even try to present itself as coherent. And indeed, Mussolini did say from time to time, that, oh, well, it's just a contradiction, so whatever. But I'm an action man, so, you shouldn't be thinking so much. It's fine. So what Jeffrey Schnapp says in any case is that there is this unstable ideological core to fascism. There are aspects that just don't go together. For example, the idea that, well, we want to be as modern as possible, we want to make the trains run on time and all that, but on the other hand, we want to go back to sort of basics. We want, women to be in the home, and we want men to be men, and a lot of traditional ideas, and those two things, they don't make sense, because you can't have both. You can either have one or the other. And so that contradiction was a problem for Schnapp, he says. And he says the way that fascism came to terms with the problem caused by its unstable ideological core was by this kind of overproduction, this sort of massive image culture that was just a sort of an outpouring of images and ideas and artefacts and statements, constantly just sort of being blasted at the Italian people in every medium possible. He was famous for his use of radio, billboards everywhere, constantly putting out pamphlets and statements and speeches and rituals and parades and the whole thing. Why so much, right? Well, one of Schnapp's theory is that by producing such a great quantity of diverse media, it helped to kind of compensate for what was underneath an unstable and fundamentally incoherent ideology. So that's his argument about how fascism worked and why, today we sort of, there's that famous article by Susan Sontag called Fascinating Fascism. And in it she sort of argues that, how the fascists, particularly Hitler, used, uniforms and parades and all those things to kind of suck people in. Now, Schnapp's theory has its qualities, which I think are quite useful, but in recent times it's come under question a little bit as not really the whole story. So, there are other ways of talking about fascist culture which don't go along with Schnapp's idea, which we can talk about now or later if you want to.
Yeah, that would be great. So what are some of those ideas?
Well, of course, the traditional idea was that, fascism was by no means incoherent. It was quite clear what it wanted. It wanted to oppress people and, shut down thought and, invade other countries and kill people and murder people. So we need to sort of, I don't necessarily call it the Marxist tradition, but there's a Marxist tradition of fascism was a kind of outpouring of capitalism and, imperialism. And
isn't it essentially that fascism is the kind of monster that capitalism unleashes on society when there's a kind of threat to its system?
That's right. Or it also says that what capitalism does, because capitalism is defined by this kind of ever erupting sort of movement and revolution, innovation, and everything, that kind of upheaval. Society gets turned inside out every sort of 10 years. And so all that energy of technological innovation and change is supposed to be directed, towards making life better for people. In a Marxist tradition, it should be directed towards, revolution and to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But actually, what happens is that the capitalists don't want that, right? So what they do is they direct all that energy into conquering and to making war and to turning war into a kind of a spectacle. So that's sort of the Marxist theory. Then there's other theories about fascism, I guess, coming just from a sort of liberal perspective, is that it's just about shutting down free speech and all those sorts of things. Then we have Schnapp's theory, which is that, it's kind of unstable ideology and it doesn't really make sense and it has to paper over those cracks with this massive overproduction of culture. And then there's another theory which has come out more recently by a historian by the name of Roger Griffin, who's really become, I guess, the go-to person. He's produced a theory of fascism which is now accepted in many quarters as the definition of fascism, which applies across the board, not just to Italy and Germany. And I hesitate to use this word because it's kind of complicated, but it's palingenetic hyper-nationalism. So I'll just boil that down and replace those words with it's an ideology which is grounded in the idea of cultural rebirth. So what looks like contradiction, you mentioned, you may remember before I said, how can you have a country that wants to have like massive industrialisation and super fast trains and, the best technology and use modern media and everything, at the same time as, seeming to want to preserve kind of peasant culture and traditional values and like go back to the past and everybody can be a farmer and all that. How do those two things go together? And what Roger Griffin says is that if you understand fascism as this ideology grounded in the idea of cultural rebirth, the word rebirth itself tells you what you need to know. It's right? So it's like, again, it's this idea of what we once had, we want to have again. But when it rebirth, so you have birth again. So we're being born newly, as it were. That's why we have all this technology. But it's also, again, it's rebirth. So we're having the peasant culture, the medieval values, the traditional gender values and everything are going to come with it. And so it's quite a compelling theory of fascism. And once you accept this theory, which I accept for the most part, but I think there are aspects of fascist culture that don't fit the model, it becomes a lot easier to understand. If anybody ever tells you they want something to be great again, you need to. The warning bells should go off.
So it's a type of synthesis in a way.
That's right.
A synthesis between the present and the past.
Exactly.
And what is the function of the past then, to make it more palatable or comfortable for people if a country's undergoing change? Is that the idea?
Yes, that is the idea. In a lot of fascist thinking, in Germany and Italy and elsewhere, is that there's always a myth underpinning it, is that we was robbed. So somebody came along, and it's often, unfortunately, Jewish people, or it could be Bolsheviks, or it could be Unionists, or whoever, people from other races who came along and spoiled everything for us. And so, in Germany, it was the stab in the back in World War One, right? That Germany would have won the war if, certain people who shall remain nameless, didn't actually compromise everything and ruin it for us. And so what you have is a theory of recent history that's gone bad, and all we need to do is just kind of go back to before that period. You do ever wake up one day and after something bad's happened and think, what was the Beatles song yesterday? Just
every morning.
Yeah, I want to go back and can we just reel back that last week? So similar things happening in Italy. But as, Roger Griffin rightly argues, if you only understand the going back part, you've completely misunderstood fascism. And if you only focus on the modern technology stuff, of course, as well, the modernity of it, which it absolutely promoted, you've missed the point. It's about the two. Now, we can have an argument about whether that was an easy fit or there were contradictions there, but that's what the sort of thing we're talking about. And, look, you see elements of this way of thinking, all the time. I mean, sometimes you hear it in football commentary. We should go back to when so-and-so was coach and, remember how we used to, it's like the good old days, but yeah. But then it's, it's also going forward in a direction that a lot of people, if they realise what was happening, they wouldn't want to go to.
This relates, it seems like, to something you wrote about Scipione, who you mentioned earlier as well.
Yeah.
You said that Scipione sought to identify a recent past made strange and alien by the destructive changes wrought by Mussolini.
Oh, yeah.
So what were, in his view, those destructive changes,
Yep.
and how did his art seek to subvert that?
So, as I said before, Scipione was an artist working in Rome. He died quite young. He was, I think, in his late 20s or early 30s, born around the turn of the century. And he started producing these works which were focusing on Rome's architecture. So, Baroque fountains, the Vatican, Trajan's Forum, the famous monuments that many of us will know very well. And, of course, local people knew intimately. And he would people these spaces with these strange kind of spectral figures. So a really famous example is the example of a work called The Roman Prostitute. And I think it's a Roman courtesan, sort of translates as, I forget the exact Italian title. But he has Trajan's Forum in the background. So you imagine a painting, if I may paint a word picture, there's a painting with Trajan's Forum in the background. So with these broken columns, there's a couple of Baroque era churches in the back which are behind Trajan's Forum in Rome, where this picture is being taken, where this painting is being created. And then in the foreground, there's this strangely kind of overweight, elaborately dressed prostitute figure who's winking and smiling at the viewer. And the interesting thing about this painting, it sounds kind of like, oh, whatever, another painting of a prostitute. But actually, there are little details in the painting that really hit home. So the first thing to say about it is everybody who saw that painting at the time in 1930 would have been perfectly well aware that the exact spot where she was standing was where all the demolitions were taking place in Mussolini's Rome. Or there were many, but there's one major place where he was creating this huge avenue, the avenue of the empire, like knocking down recent buildings and just absolutely decimating the urban landscape to create these kind of imperial parade ready marching kind of platforms for his armies and for his spectacle. So you've got traditional architecture in the background. The modern architecture around the scene where this prostitute's standing is just all been demolished. It's not shown, but it would have been absolutely clear to everybody who looked at the painting at the time that that's where she was standing. Now, who is this figure? The way she's dressed, she's wearing two different pairs of shoes. Like, they're not the same. She's got these really old-fashioned kind of like ermine stole and, big sort of flouncy petticoats and, very heavily made up and everything. And her style of dress is very outmoded for the time. It looks like something from, 1910s or 1920s. So it's you sort of to understand that it's a bit of a older prostitute, or maybe a prostitute who's kind of like a ghost who's kind of come back from a past that's no longer there. So I know this sounds quite subtle, but when you put all the different parts of it together, and also the fact that the painting's painted in this very deep red colour, and it's very... at the time, it was sort of described as making people think of dysentery. Like, it had almost like a diseased feeling about it. Mm-hmm. Very hot, very passionate, but also a little bit irksome. And so demolished buildings, historical background, Mussolini's changes that he's producing in Rome, and then this sort of spectral figure who kind of re-emerges almost as if the demolitions have unearthed this ghost who we've all tried to forget about. And so what I'm trying to say when I write about this painting is that if you follow Roger Griffin's argument, like a lot of art at the time combines modernity, so you might have, in architecture, clean lines, geometric form, kind of classic modern building, but that evokes classicism. It might have things that look kind of like classical columns or classical pediments, and it's like a synthesis, the word used earlier, of the two. What I'm saying Scipione is doing is saying, look, I'm taking the present and the past, and I'm sort of showing you how it's quite disturbing. It's a little bit like surrealism, a little bit like something from your subconscious that's kind of haunted you, that you've forgotten about, but when something drastic changes in your environment, it suddenly re-emerges like a revenant, basically, something a little bit that you've repressed and didn't want to think about. And so some artists, I argue, somewhat different to Roger Griffin, aren't really up with this whole synthesis between the present and the past. They're actually trying to crack that synthesis open and sort of show how it's kind of a bit raw and bleeding. It doesn't always work, and that's sort of the essence of my argument about Scipione. He's an incredible artist, died very young of tuberculosis, and after the war particularly, but even during the time, he was favoured by a lot of artists, and so that fact itself shows you just how diverse fascism itself was. There was an audience for this material at the time.
Was that work commissioned by the regime?
No, but importantly, he did get commissions. Sorry, let me put it differently to that. He didn't get commissions, sorry. What he did was he got commissions from publishers at the time who were publishing work. They weren't official, necessarily government organs, but he did exhibit in official exhibitions, and he did win a prize for a portrait of a cardinal around about the same time, which has a similar feel to it. It sort of has this apocalyptic. That's the other thing about Scipione that's so amazing. You have these, fascism's all about, hey, things are going great, basically, right? We're all modern, but we're sort of traditional, so it's good, right?
Isn't it kind of both, though? Because
Yeah.
underlying their rhetoric is, but things are also terrible, and we're keeping the terrible thing at bay.
They are, and that's important, but it's not kind of, at least in high art, in other art, so, in caricatures and mass printing and stuff, there's lots of, terrible stereotypical things being said about all sorts of people. But in the high art world, that doesn't tend to be the case. It tends to be focusing more on the positive things. And that's why in the domain of painting or sculpture or, official architecture, when you see something that's different, it really has a big impact. And so, in his there's a lot of apocalyptic imagery in Scipione, and it's clear because of the subject matter that, the apocalypse is not like the things we're getting rid of. The apocalypse is the fact that we're getting rid of things or that things are being got rid of, and really dark skies that look like Revelation, really serious, the stars fell from the sky and, the mountains fell into the sea and all that kind of stuff. There's this real end of days kind of feeling to his work, which some people say is about the fact that he was quite ill and had what turned out to be a terminal illness. But there's a lot of evidence to show that he was really thinking about, and this is not to say that he was anti-fascist, right? Because there were fascists who criticised fascism, like it's not fascist enough or it's fascist in the wrong way. And I think he sort of fits into that.
Into the latter or into...
I think he's into the latter. That he's a kind of, he was a Catholic. And Catholics were kind of up with it, like fascism, and there was a lot of reason why they might think they were the same thing. But on the other hand, there are a lot of problems. Mussolini was seeking to usurp the Catholic Church, even though he was making an agreement with it. And if you were a true believer in Catholicism, you'd have a lot of problems about fascism, potentially, because, Mussolini was, even though he healed the rift between the Church and state, he also said a lot of dreadful things about the Pope and about the Catholic Church in general. So it's there would be people who would have really serious qualms about fascism at that time, and there were Catholic, intellectuals, definitely. In the case of Scipione, which I just described, I suppose my point was merely that I think he's kind of showing where you have modernity happening in a place like Rome. There are problems which are created by that, and sometimes things that are disturbing, sickening, confronting emerge out of that change. Not like, oh well, here are all the mythological gods from ancient Greece who are sort of smiling down on us as we sort of knock all these buildings down. Like it's something else. So another case of an artist is, you might be familiar with the Futurist movement. So Futurism was a movement that began in 1909, and Marinetti, who was the leader of the movement, there were lots of artists like Boccioni and De Pero, who I'm about to say something about, Balla, Cala. They were artists who just wanted art to move away from the past, just only be interested in modernity. Fast cars, skyscrapers, trains moving at high speed. And that was the art. The art was full of that, and you had all this evocation of movement and dynamism and social change and buildings being constructed. So their paintings are full of all these things. Cafes, bright lights, big city, not traditional art. And what's interesting about an artist like Fortunato De Pero, who was from Trentino in the north of Italy, he was a very interesting artist because he was a futurist. So he would produce these weird geometric, brightly coloured, highly patterned, semi-abstract paintings that evoked this idea of modernity and movement and the upheaval of modern society. But he also did it in a way which evoked at the same time folk artisanal practices. So from quilting and from woodworking that was local to his Trentino area. And what you find in his work is this rather peculiar combination and I think contradiction between traditional folk art and modern cubist, futurist, expressionist kinds of styles. And now there are some things in common there. A lot of folk art decorative routines used to decorate folk art objects often have geometric shapes on them. You might be able to identify in your mind a few examples, and it's true definitely around that part of near the Alps, in the north of Italy. You often see the interiors of houses and wooden carts and things that have these brightly coloured geometric forms on them. So he was doing this very modern thing, but also doing this very old-fashioned thing. So there are ways to do that. There are ways to do it that make it seem like a smooth kind of synthesis, that they belong together. But what I argue is that Depero did it in a way that made it seem there was something kind of strange or wrong about it. And the reason the reason I say that is because he sometimes would depict events and people where you would see things like, I don't know, a soldier being blown up by a bomb, and his body's sort of disintegrating and bleeding everywhere, but in this kind of folk artisanal method. So, when you look at folk art, you kind of tend to assume it's going to be peaceful. It'll depict, if it does depict anything at all, it'll be quite balanced, it'll be symmetrical, it'll depict kind of peaceful scenes of the landscape and, cows.
I was going to say in nature. Is what
exactly,
I think of, yeah.
Right. So, but he would take that style, that kind of folk art, which tended to signify, how things used to be in the past. They were good, right? And then he would make a work which showed soldiers blowing each other up and with body parts disintegrating and people dying, on a mountaintop. And he made it in felt. So there were these also fabric art. It's not like a really modern art style. So you've got this very modern, like World War I era topic. This is a work made in 1925 called Warriors Festival, right? So you've got this very modern topic of people being blown up on a mountainside in, modern high-tech warfare. But the way it's depicted is in this very old-fashioned kind of homey sort of folk art technique. And so I argue, there's no accident that those two things are brought together. I'm arguing actually that what Depero was seeking to do there was to really reveal or lay open some of the problems and some of the issues and that kind of rift between the present and the past. We've got this past that we've brought with us, but it's being kind of torn asunder, by modernity in a way, rather than a peaceful transition or a kind of smooth synthesis between the two. So again, I guess it's hard to talk about artworks in an audio form, but hopefully I've been able to convey something of the flavour of these works and how they actually, open themselves to these quite sometimes disturbing and unsettling kinds of affects in the viewer.
Yeah, so it kind of seems like what they were trying to do in your argument is look at the present through the lens of the past. Yes. In a way that makes us think those in the past would be horrified by what's going on now. Yeah, that's exactly right. And really, and in a subtle way, because, you have to think, in 1930 when Scipione was doing his paintings, Mussolini, the dictatorship, really begins in earnest in 25, 26. So he's already living in a situation where you can't just say whatever you want. And so artists are able to kind of speak to us with their visual images in subtle ways. And that's why it's often quite difficult to draw out some of the subtleties of the arguments because, they're deliberately concealed. But they speak volumes. And in 1925, to go back to Fortunato Depero, whose folk art industrialised death on a mountaintop I was just describing, he's producing those works in 1925, which is just at the moment when the Italian dictatorship starts in earnest. And so it's sort of like a last hurrah, I think, of a kind of disagreement or resistance with the state of things as they are, because after that, you see Depero's work becomes much more kind of propagandistic. And he himself was a very, true believer in fascism, but I think when I look at that work from that period, just before the dictatorship really takes off, I think you can see the cracks in the edifice, right, in the mask, as it were, and they really come out quite strongly. Even if
I mean, what I don't know entirely myself is whether it's kind of unconscious or whether it's conscious, but I'm absolutely certain that it's there.
Is fascism uniquely incoherent, or are incoherence and self-contradiction just elements of ideology itself? What's your view on that?
Well, I've made a lot of study of fascism, having written a book about it and about the art. And I'm tempted to say that ideology is by definition contradictory, because at the end of the day, the point of ideology is to convince somebody that, what exists is not what should be there or what is there. I mean, in a way, if you think about, we talked about the definition of ideology before, and I don't have a hard and fast definition to hand, but there is always the idea in ideology, I suppose, that you're not quite getting the full story. An ideology is something which is trying to create a narrative out of a reality, and there's never a perfect fit. I'm not trying to evade the question. I will come to it more substantively, but I would just start with that point. I think sort of ideology is by definition kind of, it's an illusion. And you can't have an illusion if there's something which isn't there, which is there.
So you see it as a kind of cognitive mapping of the world.
Yes.
That doesn't quite fit everywhere.
Never quite maps, does it? I mean, and then now I would like to pursue the argument which I haven't given enough thought to, so I'll be brief. Is liberal democracy incoherent? Is communism incoherent? I mean, so is liberal democracy incoherent? I mean, now people might say that it is.
I would argue that it is.
Yeah. I mean, you might say that it claims to give freedom and welfare to the broad populace and be a way of representing a plurality of views, but actually what ends up happening, I guess I'm taking words out of your mouth, is the opposite. And so then it becomes kind of incoherent. But I think what's different about fascism, at least in the Italian case, is that I can't quote chapter and verse, but Mussolini was actually aware of the fact that a lot of his ideas didn't make a lot of sense. And, he used to be a socialist, and what happened in Italy and in a lot of places is when World War I started, that kind of that was like scattering the chess pieces, really, and everybody kind of went into different camps. So Mussolini did say, I'm pretty sure that, don't worry about, I know it's a contradiction, but, it was more for him, it was more about the idea of will and action and those sorts of things. So in answer to your question, I guess what we're talking about is whether something presents itself as coherent and yet isn't underneath, and then whether something kind of presents itself in a much more obvious way as not quite coherent. And look, maybe it's the case in fascism that there was at least in the early days, there was a bit more room for presenting artworks that seemed a bit incoherent along the ways I've been describing, simply because that was the nature of the way politics was being done in those days. And so, look, it's an interesting hypothesis which I haven't thought about enough.
Can you explain the concept of plastic solidity to me? Because I saw it a number of times.
That's a good one. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I had a student ask me about this the other day. They said to me, look, this is confusing. Isn't there a semiotic for fascist art? And I wasn't quite sure what he meant at first, but I think what he was trying to say is surely there is a set of rules, right, for what fascist art is supposed to look like. And I immediately used the word plastic solidity to answer him. The reason I said that is because in a speech that Mussolini made in 1926, which was actually written by his then lover Margherita Sarfatti, he spoke about the idea of plastic solidity in art. And it was an ideal that Mussolini said in this speech at an opening of an exhibition. He said that all good Italian art should aspire to. So the two terms, plastic doesn't mean, stuff made out of plastic. It's more in a sculptural sense. So at the time, in German, it would be three-dimensionality, right? So something's the three-dimensional. So in painting, for example, the idea was that in Mussolini's idea, good Italian art should be plastic. It should have this strong sense of three-dimensionality. So what that means in painting is that it's an illusion of a three-dimensional thing in a space that's three-dimensional. So when you look at a painting, if you see what looks like a solid object, so it might have shading on one side and light on the other, and finely modulated so that you get the illusion. It's like a ball. Imagine just a ball in space, right? That's kind of plasticity. And then the solidity part of it is just like something that's not kind of transparent or airy or sort of insubstantial. It's something kind of monumental. So his idea in this speech was that Italian art should really have this quality in painting, for example, of three-dimensionality and of kind of massive solidity. And that's a metaphor, right, for a lot of things in fascism, which is reliability, sturdiness, earthiness, and all these things, so that in the painting, and this became a kind of formula that a lot of fascist artists started to follow, more or less explicitly, but you can start to see from 1926 a lot more artists doing this. So instead of, in Impressionism, which was a few decades before, it was the opposite of plastic solidity, so-called, because, things looked kind of flat. You couldn't sort of tell where one object started and another began. In Impressionism, famously, like, people and objects look kind of flat. They don't actually look like they're three-dimensional because the surface of the painting is being drawn attention to. So in opposition to this, Mussolini's talking about plastic solidity to kind of go against all of that, which was too modern, right? And the other great thing for the fascists about plastic solidity is that they asserted that that's exactly what the Renaissance was doing. So think back to Leonardo, right, with his famous sfumato, right, which was like shading, this delicate shading of three-dimensional objects. I mean, just think about the Mona Lisa if you want, or any Leonardo work, and Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling, Adam and God and all that, like, they are looking very 3D, right?
Makes a lot of sense as well for fascism to want to align itself with the Renaissance.
And there are a lot of artists, and the ones we've been speaking about today, both Fortunato de Pero, the futurist, was making these things that looked very flat and geometric. And then Scipione was the same, because the colour in his work was very monochrome, by which I mean kind of only one colour. And when you have only one colour, you drain out the three-dimensionality of it, because you're not using colour to show, okay, this is behind that and this is in front of that. So this, I hesitated, almost an aesthetic ideology of plastic solidity in art was followed by the fascists. And you get a lot of, if you think about the classic sturdy athlete, standing there, or soldier, looking out at the horizon, the typical kind of kitsch fascist painting, what you'll observe is very finely painted gradations of shade and colour and form to create a convincing illusion of three dimensions. And the figures always look rooted to the ground, firmly planted, a man or a woman with their legs kind of slightly apart because, they have a low centre of gravity, and you can rely on this guy, he's sturdy and he's everything. Not those other, paintings which are all weird and from other countries and maybe Bolshevik or maybe even Jewish, where they have flat surfaces and they have bright colours that are really distracting, and you might be able to see the brushstrokes, which is distracting from the illusion of three-dimensionality. So when it came down to aesthetics, for a lot of people there was a sort of identifiable fascist style, even though it was sort of not really followed strictly by everyone. There were a lot of people who were just ignoring it. And again, that's going back to our original point, is that the plurality. So, it's interesting, Mussolini comes up with this idea. He didn't come up with it, but he propagated it. But people didn't follow it. That's because of the pluralism thing and wanting to kind of catch all the different butterflies in the garden,
Right, but it also sounds like, from what you've said, that a number of artists did try to ingratiate themselves to the regime by following this style he outlined in that speech. If you were to look at art today, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be art in this way, but even media.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see any style or type of content, for lack of a better word, the 21st century word, that you think does a similar thing in trying to ingratiate itself to power?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there was once upon a time powerful institutions, governments, individuals would have always gone for traditional, classical, ancient resonances in their art. So, if they wanted to, if a corporation or a government or a religion, wanted to impress you with their power, they would get a very skillful artist who was good at rendering a convincing illusion of three dimensions and have, clearly delineated figures with a narrative, right, behind it. And so here's the victory of our state, conquering the demons of, the depression or whatever it is. It might be allegorical, and that was true right up until, I don't know, the 1930s or so. But the funny thing that happens around World War II, and I'll get up into the contemporary, but just as a way of sort of leading us there was a funny thing which happened in the 50s, in the USA, for example, where suddenly abstract art was all a go. As I was saying earlier, one of the reasons we look back at fascism and some of the classical references and stuff, and which I think is totally unfair actually, that it's all retrograde, and if you're referring to classical past, that means you're a fascist or you're authoritarian or something, then that meant a whole lot of artists started doing abstraction because, if that's bad, I'll do the opposite, so that's freedom. Being like Jackson Pollock throwing paint around, that must mean, I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, whatever. And so gradually over time, all the corporations, for example, they have these massive abstract paintings in their lobbies, and abstract art kind of became corporate lobby decor. So there's a whole style thinking kind of switch on in time. So anyway, that's in the 1950s.
Can I just pause there for a moment? Because this is something I've never understood. If we agree that, corporations are the ones with power nowadays, why do they prefer a sort of left-wing aesthetic?
Well, look, there are a lot of ways of explaining it. One way of explaining it is that they don't care, and the person they hire to go and commission the art, they just don't care what it is. To them, it's just like an area on a wall. And the person they commission to do it, it just has those views, but they don't actually think it's consequential. So I guess that's one theory. I mean, as you can tell, I probably don't have a direct answer, but of course the other possible explanation and quite likely explanation is that we're all used to seeing what do they call it, like greenwashing, sport washing, community washing, whatever you want to call it. Corporations who are destroying the environment love to bleat about how they're, planting all these trees or something. I mean, companies that are in the business of destroying the livelihoods of artists through various measures probably have trumpeting their amazing art collection. So, I mean, I think it's an unfortunate and kind of sad aspect of the way ideology works is that, you get the image and then you get what's underneath. I guess it's brand management, and it's a way that they can say all the attacks that we get. Oh no, but look, we've done this thing and we've given all this money to this community project out in a region somewhere, and even though we just gutted their economy and ripped out all their jobs and sold them to a machine or another country, but look how nice we are. So I think there's just a little bit of that. That's basically the way I would put it. Yeah. But to go back to your original question about contemporary art, it's very difficult to talk about contemporary art because it's so diverse and so kind of chaotic, and I don't really claim to be an expert in contemporary art. But what I do observe is that there does seem to be a real obsession with the well-made. When I say that, what I mean is professional, high-tech production values in a lot of contemporary art, like in video art and, sculpture and technologically inspired art. There is a real slickness and a real kind of technological complexity to a lot of art. And I think it's difficult for me to talk about, I suppose, what is the art of power now, which I think is what you're asking me. But one thing I do often think is that I'm often kind of relieved when I see something that has retained something of that resistance to the idea of perfection in whatever form, whether it be in something that looks kind of handmade or, maybe doesn't conform to the idea of the spectacular, mind-blowing monument that an artwork can sometimes be, whether, through very shiny surfaces or through very expensive materials. I mean, if you think about an artist like Jeff Koons, for example, who is an artist who's like a pop artist working now in the 21st century and doing, humongous sculptures of, the Pink Panther or, Mickey Mouse or like an Andy Warhol figure. People used to think, oh, well, he's kind of poking fun at corporations and stuff and the media and all that. But actually he's not, because the amount of effort he puts into having these things made, they cost millions of dollars, right? And they have teams of people working on them. And he is like a corporation. So, and he creates these weird, the sort of balloon that you'd buy your kid at the zoo or something. It's like some mylar thing in the shape of a heart or whatever, or a tulip, and he'll take that exact thing, blow it up 25 times, make it out of steel and aluminium, and make it so bright and so shiny that it looks like something from another planet, right? And that will be like at Versailles, which is the royal palace of the French monarchy, from the 18th century, and that will be sort of in the door as you walk in. And it's like, this is impressive, and it's sort of cheeky maybe because it's like low culture meets high culture. But the way it's made and the kind of investment, he actually has to go out and raise money to afford to pay for the manufacture of these things. And when you see them, they're quite mind-blowing. They're just spectacular. I'm just always a bit wary of any art that is trying to wow you.
Mm.
And frankly, I do, if I may just make one reference to a contemporary thing, I do feel a bit that way about Yayoi Kusama, particularly some of these later installations. There's a little bit of that, particularly the way that they're orchestrated at the moment. It's all a little bit like as if nothing's too good for you. And if you look at her earlier work, there is that kind of resistance, the materiality, the idea that there's a thing there made by a person, rather than a kind of, scattering of neurons in an all-enveloping environment, which can be quite disorienting and I think distracting, and serves a purpose culturally to distract us from what's actually real.
Maybe this is not relevant to your interests, but since you mentioned being skeptical of art that tries to wow you, do you have any views on what art should try to do?
I do. I hesitate to mention it, but I guess, between you and me and hundreds of thousands of listeners, I guess I have a view which is a reflection of the sort of person that I am and the age that I am, and it, at the end of the day, it has to do somewhat with what I was saying earlier about the importance of materiality, and materiality which is not being leveraged or kind of instrumentalized to try to convince you of something else. So what I mean is when you have a thing in front of you and it's trying to say, I'm not what I say I am. I'm not what I am, I'm what I say I am. Right? So I quite like artworks that are extremely honest about how they're made, what they're made of, where they are, what they are, which means I'm a modernist, essentially. The truth to materials thing, which is an old, long-standing ideal, going right back to the late 19th century or the Bauhaus, for example, in the 30s, that in modernism, the idea of honesty, that you're not trying to trick people. You're trying to say, if you're making a canvas, you don't go, oh, look, you can walk into this wonderful world, pretend you're not here. You go, no, this is a two-dimensional surface. It's got strokes of paint on it, or this is a slab of marble. It's kind of made out of rock. It's, it's made out of a geological process that took, billions of years and all of that. So that to me, I guess at being a modernist, there's always this kind of sort of suspicion about the idea of illusion, that illusion can be suspicious because of its ideological implications. However, there's a caveat to that, which is that any art that, in my mind, that tries to deny the fact that it's actually an illusion is in some ways worse, because it's a kind of another lie, because all art is essentially based on illusion of some sort. Anything that tries to represent anything else is saying it's, I'm not what I say I am, but it's sort of how you do it. If you sort of reveal your process, it's a little bit like transparency in government, or if you go for a job interview, you don't get it. You get to find out what happened, what the thinking was, what was the process. I suppose that's the kind of art that I really admire and really find exciting and thrilling and compelling. But, there are lots of different purposes to art, and I think one of the problems with the perspective that I have inherited about art, the modernist one, which I just described to you, is that it does tend to look down its nose at references to the past. And if I may I think this is a good segue, but just a really important thing in the book I wrote, which is called Italian Modern Art in the Age of Fascism, came out about 5 years ago, still relevant though, I think, is that I had another argument in there, which was that a lot of the art in that period has been ignored or disdained over the years, particularly by English-speaking scholars. And there are many reasons for that, partly because of its being mixed up with fascism, so it was kind of taboo. We've sort of started to unpack that a little bit. But the other problem is that a lot of that art was very interested in speaking about the past and using the styles of the past to kind of talk about the present. And people like me, if I was around at that time and I had the view that I have about art now, I probably would have gone, no, that's not okay. You're not allowed to do that because progress. We've moved away from the past. Like the Futurists I described earlier, Marinetti, in 1909 said, let's burn down the libraries, let's flood the museums, let's get rid of the past. And, that's all very well, but there's a cost, right, to doing that. And modernists are guilty of pushing the past away too quickly or pretending it's not there or kind of making it taboo. And when you do that, it kind of comes back as a repressed thing and comes back to bite you. And what I was really interested to talk about in this book is to really honour, I suppose, the artists who, instead of just being pure modernists and just moving away from tradition always and saying the new thing, actually wanted to engage with the past, not to want to go back there, but to actually use the past as a kind of critical leverage to say something about the present, And so I think it's important to remember those things, because I really do think there's a danger in and I think also because a lot of people want to have nice memories about the past. They don't want it to be destroyed like Marinetti suggested. And if you suggest that to them, or if you don't give them an outlet, they'll go and find their own version of the past and bring that back, which could be worse.
There's something I like about the idea of art sometimes being a kind of dialectic between generations, but I could stay on this topic for a long time, but I want to talk to you about something else you've been working on.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because you're about to head to New York.
I am.
To give a talk about the mapping of creativity.
Correct.
Of Italian prisoners of war in Australia during the Second World War.
Yep.
How do you map creativity?
Well, what you do is you go and find it first. The problem we have, so this project is part of a 3-year study funded by the Australian Research Council, and it's led by Georgia Alu in the University of Sydney, who's an expert in Italian literature and culture. And there are people from New York University, Swinburne University, Berkeley City College, University of Oslo, as well as myself at the University of Melbourne. And we're doing this project actually about Italian prisoners of war and internees during World War II in allied countries all over the world, like so Kenya, South Africa, USA, Australia, and the list goes on. And it's a long story, but basically during World War II, lots of Italian prisoners were soldiers were captured and taken to camps in India, for example, and then came to Australia. So the part of it that I'm doing is related to Australia, and when it comes to mapping the Italians who were prisoners of war and internees in Australia, first of all, you have to find where they were, because a lot of this material's gone missing. It's not like somebody, after World War II, they closed all the prisoner of war camps, they sent the Italian soldiers back to Italy. There were citizens, there were Italian nationals, and some of them were naturalised citizens here who were then interned during the war under suspicion of being, working for Mussolini, working for the enemy. They were called enemy aliens. So it's a well-documented part of our history. Like, I'm not revealing this to anyone, but
sounds like a punk band from like the 2000s.
Yeah,
right?
enemy aliens. Yeah, totally. I like that. You have to have the typography, made out of safety pins. What isn't known really is just how much art and literature and poetry and theatre and music was being created in this time. What is by the prisoners in Australia and elsewhere. So there's a lot known already about, you might have heard of the De Niro boys. So there was a ship called the De Niro which carried German Jewish refugees who'd fled Nazi Germany and went to London, and then they were actually, even though they were against the Nazis and were being persecuted by the Nazis, they were arrested as being under suspicion of working for the enemy, and they were shipped out to Australia on the De Niro. So there were a lot of those people ended up being very important members of our Australian society. We know a little bit about the work, well, quite a lot actually now, about the work that was being done by those paintings, books, poetry. They set up universities in the camps and so forth. Same thing happened in the Italian case, but we just don't know anything about it. So the way we're mapping this is we're going to the different sites and going to local communities and saying, hey, you had a camp in this town. Have you got anything left from those days? Because the camps are gone, buildings are gone, the property's been given back to the private owners and then sold on and so forth. So there's a little bit, so in places like Cowra in New South Wales, in Loveday in South Australia, in Tatura in Victoria, Murchison, the list goes on. So there's plenty of places. We're mapping by going out to these places and visiting them and contacting them, also remotely, and just gathering as much material as we can. Then we're analysing the material, writing about it, photographing it, and putting it up on a website that we're going to use to display the full richness of these amazing collections of work. So just to give you, just to give the people listening a kind of a picture of what we're talking about. One of the things I'm talking about with my colleague Flavia Marcello from Swinburne University, I'll be speaking at NYU, which is New York University, in a few days' time, actually. There was two artists. One was Eliseo Pieracini and the other one was Carlo Vanucci, and they're both from Viareggio, right? So they are soldiers. They go to North Africa. They fight. They get captured by the Allies. They get taken to India and imprisoned there, and then they get brought out here and they're taken to Cowra. They're both artists. Once you get to Cowra, these camps, they were a long way from home. They were bored. People had problems, mental health problems. There were fights. There were a very regimented existence. But these camps, I don't want to give the impression either that it was all nice, but I also don't want to give the impression that it was this kind of horror show of people being murdered and stuff. Like, it wasn't like a concentration camp. The prisoner of war camps were extremely difficult to be there for so long, for so many years, from 41 to 46 or something like that, away from their family and everything for ages. But anyway, in the meantime, they were allowed to do all sorts of things. So they were allowed to work on farms, they were allowed to work in the camp. But they did all these things, like they created a chapel in the camp. So Pieracini and Vanucci together did landscape paintings of the local area. They painted reminiscences of their hometown in Viareggio. They did portraits of the wife of the local commandant, and all this stuff still exists. It's amazing. And it's like nobody talks about this stuff, and it's such an interesting moment in our history. And the real killer for me is when I went to Cowra and I saw these paintings by Pieracini and Vanucci. It's the Virgin Mary and John the Beloved, right, the Apostle, at the crucifixion. Two older pieces, And the Virgin Mary and John the Beloved, two separate altar pieces either side of the crucifix, right? So they're two separate paintings, one by Pieracini, one by Vannucci. Pieracini's Virgin Mary painting is a very traditional, like, religious iconography, as you can imagine, like, you know, the Virgin Mary there. In the landscape, you quickly realise, you know, she ain't in, like, Tuscany, right? She's in Cowra. So you can see the hills in the background, the gum trees, right? And the local flora and fauna around her feet. And get this, she's standing on a piece of barbed wire. Virgin Mary's standing on a piece of barbed wire. And there's a little bit of blood coming off her foot there. And he signed it, you know, Pieracini, Italian prisoner of war, 1946. And then the John the Beloved by Vannucci's a similar thing, right? He's looking up. He was Jesus' best friend or something. So anyway, like, to me, I find these paintings so incredibly poignant because, you know, it would have been so terrible to be so far away from home, imprisoned, bored, you know, having a terrible life. And so they found a way to, you know, kind of come to terms with their experience. And they spoke to, you know, their passion, right? Like Christ's passion, I suppose, you know, with the barbed wire.
Because usually Mary's standing on a snake. So that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? So you've got that. So they use the traditional Italian iconography and the religious belief, but put it in an Australian context. So, but also spoke to their own personal experience, you know, in a kind of, again, veiled manner, a little bit like the fascists I was saying earlier. Because, you know, there's a genre of religious art and you can't go too crazy, you know, with like, you know, talking about have a commandant standing in the background with a gun or something. So what we find is that, you know, creativity, we're mapping the creativity, but what we're really mapping is sort of not the objects so much. I mean, that's the means to the end. What we're really mapping is just the incredible diversity and also, I guess, emotional richness of the lives that are being documented in these incredible artworks made by people who, you know, are imprisoned thousands of miles away from home. And then in another paper I'm also giving with my colleague Flavia Marcello at the John Calandra Institute, Italian-American Institute in New York, we're talking about another artist called Lamberto Ionna, who was actually an internee. And he was locked up under suspicion of being an enemy alien. And he produced these amazing comics and cartoons about the life of being an internee in Australia. And, you know, when you put together with all these blokes that you've never really had anything to do with, there'd be a lot of annoying people, right? And you would be annoying other people. So he does all these humorous things. So there's this thing called, cartoon he produced called All in One Voice, Tutta una voce, right? All together now, or all in one voice. And he just shows this little everyman character who's in the camp, and he says, if I hang out by myself, people say I'm a hermit. If I spend all my time hanging around with lots of friends, they say I'm just, you know, looking to be popular. If I, you know, go around reading all the time, you know, just sitting around just doing that, you know, they think, oh, I'm trying to be an intellectual, I'm trying to, you know, big note myself. But if I play sport, you know, oh, I'm an idiot, you know. So it's like
high school.
You can't do anything right. Exactly. No, it's fantastic. It's very funny. And, you know, Lamberto Ionna, who was this artist who landed here in the 1920s and got locked up for, you know, maybe, look, I don't think we're justified, frankly. Like a lot of cases. There was a lot of paranoia at the time. We're talking about 1940, 41.
Right.
Anyway, to cut the story short, the humour about the situation, I mean, the guy was just so funny in the face of really pretty dreadful situation, really. And his wife this is the really bad part about the internees here, which is well documented. Their wives and kids are just left. They have to look after. The dads are gone. That's it, you know. Yeah. And the wife is just stuck there like, what do I do now? Right? Well, they have to shut up the shop or the house and go and live with a relative or whatever. And, you know, I was so shocked, you know, in Queensland, 50% of the Italian male population was imprisoned.
Oh, wow.
50%.
But they were immigrants, though.
They were immigrants to Australia. They were living here. Some of them have been living here for 20 years.
So they were locked up together with soldiers who had been fighting?
They were in separate compounds.
Okay, got it.
And sometimes they had dedicated. So Loveday had internees, I know that. Some camps had a bit of both. Some had, Germans in one compound and Japanese in another one and Italians in another one and Koreans in another one. Like it was quite a bizarre thing. But the thing that really gets me is just, I think what interests me about this, well, my great uncle was a guard in the garrison battalion in Tatura in the 1940s, so I sort of feel like a personal connection. And I suppose I feel a little bit like, I don't know how to put this, but I don't know, we Australians just seem to be so good at locking people up when it's really not warranted or even helpful. And yeah, my great uncle, I didn't meet him. He was an artist. Like he by all accounts, he was a fantastic guy. And it was just like a job for him. I don't know.
Right.
I never got the chance to ask him. And I think for me, it's interesting for me to reflect on what Australia is, and how we treated our friends and compatriots essentially. And because of my great love for Italian culture, it's a great way to bring these two sides of my life together. But I've ended up working on, Italian things both in Australia and also in Italy. It's a sort of an interesting way of sort of seeing it from the other side a little bit.
What's the difference, seeing it from the other side?
Well, look, seeing it from the other side is, I guess, we talk about fascism and everything, and we referred to this earlier, I suppose. We talked about, every time you write about Mussolini or you write about fascist Italy, you've got to kind of say, okay, now, what did Berlusconi once say? Mussolini wasn't that bad. He only sent people away on holiday. Like, he didn't lock anyone up. Like, you do get this, what is it, Bellagente thing, about Italians. But actually, some really bad stuff happened, right? Like, bad, like in Africa, gassing. I don't mean like gas chambers, but bombing gas onto local soldiers. Like hundreds of thousands of people died and injured. Some Jewish people were sent to concentration camps from Italy during the war. Germans were involved in that. But, you have to kind of acknowledge that some really bad stuff happened. But, speaking as, I guess, and I'm the only skip on this project, I think. Yes, everybody else there
Very impressive.
Has Italian heritage. So, I've made it, finally. But I suppose speaking from the other side, as a Anglo-Irish kind of person. So I'm seeing what we did during the war. It's easy to think, battlers, us Anzacs, we won the war and all this sort of stuff and we were the good guys and rah, rah, rah. Well, some of this stuff was pretty shameful. I reckon locking up half of the Italian male population in Queensland is pretty bad.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a hot take, but I'll go with you on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I guess, I've spent so much time researching other countries, having lived in Italy and then in the US and other countries, and now I've been living more or less continuously in Australia for 20 years, and I also felt I wanted to kind of bring it back home, but use my Italian experience and expertise to kind of talk about something that went on here, and I think I can really add something to it, it's great to be. I'm very, very. I'm delighted to be in this project because I really feel like a bit like with the book Italian Modern Art in the Age of Fascism. I was telling a story that hadn't been told enough, just about the diversity of Italian art under fascism. It wasn't all like kind of jackboots and classical sculpture. Same thing about Australia is that if we talk about Australian art, is this Australian art? War art by Italian prisoners of war and internees made in Australia during World War II. It's where does that belong in the history of Australian art? And there are lots of really amazing Italians who've contributed to the Australian art world over the years. Dattilo Rulbo, for example, in New South Wales, or Gino Nibbi, who was this famous bookshop owner, had a great bookshop in Melbourne, and he basically informed and launched a lot of the thinking around the angry penguins in the 1940s, because he was one of the few people who actually had contacts with, artistic and cultural things in Europe. So I think it's just really important to document and talk about not just, prison art, which is amazing in itself, and you really feel for the people who were involved, and they produce some amazing things under very difficult circumstances, but also just telling a different story about Australia overall and like Italians' contribution to this country, which has just been so amazing, so significant. The really interesting thing that I found out in the course of doing this work is that Franco Belgiorno Nettis, he started the business called Transfield, right? And he founded the Sydney Biennale. He was a prisoner of war in India. He was captured in North Africa and taken to India, and he did paintings there.
And he was taken here?
He didn't come here at the time. He went back to Italy and then migrated.
Got it.
So, when you get into these what seem like esoteric pockets of research, it suddenly starts to spread out, and you see all sorts of amazing connections. And I think, it just adds to the richness and the diversity of how we understand Italian Australian culture, which to me is just such an important part of who we are.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like a lot of people, even within the Italian community, would have no idea that this stuff exists. So if possible, it'd be great to maybe get some photos of some of it if you can share it. And
I can share it with you.
That would be
problem.
great. And we'll overlay it while you're talking about it.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah,
I'd
that'd
love
be
to do that.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
Well, Professor Anthony White, I really appreciate your time and your insights today. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. It's been great, Raymond.